This government meeting is brought to you by Eastworks and our local cable subscribers.
All right, let's call to order the City Council Ordinance Committee, and the date is June 27th. It's about 12 minutes past our normal start time, but that's okay. We're all here. And let's see, no minutes to approve.
So we do have a bunch that we need to approve eventually. So
Okay.
after this meeting, I'm going to send an entire batch
Okay.
of meeting minutes over, because the next step is that Barb is
She's gonna come
she's
down.
gonna come for me.
Yeah.
Been there.
Nobody here from the public.
Right.
So we have two pieces on our agenda. So we have amend section 10.04 to add an exemption for electronic mail. So we don't need to talk about that. We have consideration of zoning waivers and change of board review under section 11-13. So that's what we're going to discuss. All right. So tell me if I'm wrong. That is a recording.
Okay.
Yeah. This basically allows for a consideration of waiving some parking requirements for some parcels of land in certain zoning districts, specifically neighborhood business. Or I mean, is it even specific to those zones? It's citywide.
The place where the places right now where it's happening happen to all be
In neighborhood business. Right.
Okay.
But it could apply to any zone
Sure.
in the city.
Right.
And this doesn't allow for anything by right. This basically allows for a consideration for particular properties that might be, if they are not being used, or if their use changes, could potentially be unusable.
Yes. So there's currently, Jeff has a whole list. I cannot vote on this because I'm
Right.
helping my friends to potentially purchase a building like this. And so I'm conflicted out of voting, but that doesn't mean that as
You
a
can-
citizen,
you can talk.
I can't speak
Yeah.
about it.
Sure.
So the property that they're dealing with is the old Peter Pan Cafe at
Right.
46 Pleasant Street. But I know that there's a couple properties on Parsons Street that are dealing with similar things. I think there's a couple around the other neighborhood business areas like South and Main.
South and Main.
And I think there's a couple businesses around there. And sort of what all these businesses have in common is that they were developed
Prior to
us orienting our entire society around the car.
Right.
And they don't have the off-street parking required to be any sort of business in that district, because in that particular district, everything requires at least
Off-street.
some off-street parking. So I know that Jeff was mentioning there's a person who owns a building right now on Parsons Street that he would like to put an art gallery in.
Right.
There's abundant on-street parking. There's
Right.
no off-street parking.
Right. So he wouldn't be able to do that.
He cannot. He just owns a building that is not usable.
Right.
I guess I have not spoken to this person, but my understanding is he's not super pleased about that.
Yeah.
And again, like this building, like right now, there's some discussion about potentially purchasing a building on Pleasant Street. Well, the building takes up the entirety of the parcel. There's literally not a single place where you could put one parking spot. There is a whole stretch of street where very, very few people park, especially in the evenings. So there would be enough off-street parking to meet the parking requirement that is in the zoning,
Right.
but it's not
On the-
off-street parking.
Right.
And so all that this does is it just says that permit granting authorities, so the ZBA and the planning board, can at their discretion waive the parking requirement if there's reasons, if they think that there's a valid reason why the parking requirement isn't actually applicable here.
Right.
And so the reasons for that could include close by public parking, abundant on-street parking. Maybe it's a sort of place that,
Yeah.
whatever. Like that.
Or I think another potential piece of that could be like an agreement with someone who owns, like for example, there's a church like on the Pleasant Street.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's a church across the street that's not being used, right?
Right.
So you could get a potential sign, something from that property owner saying, hey, between the hours of this, I don't care if people park there,
Yeah.
which could potentially alleviate the need for on-property parking as well.
Yes, and currently there is something like that. That we do have something saying that we'll make some allowance for shared parking agreements,
Right.
but the parking in that case needs to be within 300 feet,
Oh.
which is not very far.
No, it's pretty
And,
close.
that might be a different thing that is worth looking at some point. The other thing is, like, you take the example of that church, well, the diocese will at some point sell that.
Right.
And so if
Right,
we
right,
were
so
to
it's
do
not
that, would
permanent.
this business then have to close?
Right.
So I think what they're looking for is sort of an ability to say, we're going to be allowed to operate. Now, does that,
Yeah.
they could come up with all these other ways to handle their own parking, but I just think like there's sort of this like, is this allowable? Like,
Right.
given the situation, given that every business around there closes at 5 p.m. And now the ZBA could still say no.
Right.
So this is suggesting that people from certain businesses would be able to park in other people's businesses when
No.
they're closed?
That was just my suggestion.
Okay,
that-
so can we kind of back up a little bit?
Sure.
This is like an area that I don't understand
Okay.
much about.
So when you are applying for, to open a business, some uses are allowed by right. But outside of downtown, many uses require either site plan approval or a special permit.
Okay.
At which point it's going to either the ZBA, Zoning Board of Appeals, or it's
Yep.
going to the Planning Board, depending on the type of business and the zone and a couple other things.
Okay.
So, in those cases, they have all these requirements that you need to meet in order to receive a permit and you need that permit before you can get a building permit
Right,
to do
right.
anything.
Yep.
So, one of the requirements of virtually every type of business in Easthampton outside of the downtown business and industrial to some extent is there's a requirement that you have a certain amount of off-street parking.
Okay.
And that generally is tied to the size of the business. Like it can be
Okay.
tied to square footage. It can be tied to the use. Like certain uses require more.
For a bar, it's tied to the number of seats
Right.
and the number of staff.
Oh, okay,
Um,
okay.
So, it's but for whatever it is, like there's a different formula for each use type, and that's all in our enormous zoning ordinance. But the thing is, there are some buildings in Easthampton. I don't mean to keep coming back to this one, but it's the case that I understand the most, and I think the one of how it's the most illustrative of why this has become a problem. The Peter Pan Cafe opened in 1946 and operated until 2018, when it was closed under we had some problem with the government. But during that time, I believe that when it initially started operating, this zoning was not in existence, and so they kind of just were a continuously operating place, and they were. I think we've decided that grandfathered in is not like a PC term.
It was
somehow.
pre-existing use.
Pre-existing use is what we're saying now.
Yeah.
Okay. But it was a pre-existing use that was fine. It has now been closed for long enough that anybody who wanted to buy that building or rent that building to operate it in any sense would have to, you couldn't just say, well, this is pre-existing use.
Mhm.
It's been closed for 5 years now. And so you would have to go and get a permit for whatever you wanted to do. And there really isn't a use type in that district that doesn't require off-street parking. And there is not a single space worth of square footage.
Right.
I mean, the parcel really hugs the building.
Yeah, right.
And so there is no way for that building to conform with the current zoning when it comes to parking requirements.
Okay.
As a result of that, if the zoning is not amended, that building will be vacant for the rest of time. It will continue to deteriorate physically. It will become it is currently, in my opinion, blighted. It will become a public safety and public health hazard.
Because there's no physical way that they can
I
meet the threshold for parking because of the...
Yes.
And I don't
Okay.
even think if you change the use just to like an apartment, you would still need to have on-site parking.
That's what I'm
Right,
saying.
right,
You could
right.
do
It's like-
a retail, you could do a flower store, you could do
Or just like a home office,
yeah,
you
it's
would
like-
still need parking.
There's really,
right?
there aren't, I mean, it could be that there's some sort of use that does not require parking that I missed. I haven't looked over the whole thing. What I will say is that, that is a multi-$100,000 renovation job to get that place up and running. So for a home office, I mean, you could just buy a house
Right.
for that, you
Sounds
just buy a new house with a bigger office. Like
Right.
it's really like, it's very difficult for me to envision any possible use of that space that would be allowable under the current parking requirements. So all that this proposed change from President Gomez and Councilor Derby does, and this, Jeff had worked to suggest some of this language, because this is based off, I believe Amherst has this language already, and many other communities have something like this. If it just says that they, I mean, you can look at the language, but it just says that they're allowed to grant a waiver.
Doesn't say that they have to.
They don't
just-
have to.
They're just allowed to.
They're allowed to. If a bunch of neighbors show up and say, hey, we don't want this here, well, maybe they just won't grant a waiver.
Right.
But they're allowed to, and so it's the only hope of this building, in particular, ever being anything other than a blighted eyesore. Beyond that, there's at least a couple other buildings that including the one I mentioned on Parsons Street, the art gallery, that right now are just not usable for the same reason. And that's before we get into any of the currently existing buildings,
Yeah.
that if they were to close and somebody wanted to use that property,
Then it gets
would
shut out.
they wouldn't be in conformance.
So they would lose their pre-existing status, and then
Yes.
it would have to be brought up to code somehow.
Yeah, and in many cases, I mean, a lot of these buildings that were built in the late 1800s or 1900s,
Right.
they were just built like, this is the parcel, we're gonna build
Yeah.
the whole thing to the parcel,
Right.
Mhm.
And so there just isn't.
Right, there are structures in Easthampton that were built when we were still using horses.
Yeah.
So,
Or when-
and before zoning existed.
Right.
I mean, the Peter Pan, that was the bar for the factory workers when all of the mills were still operating industrially. I've done a lot of research into this over the last few months. That bar used to open at 6 a.m. So when the night shift workers got
Okay.
off of work and
Yeah.
they wanted to socialize for a bit before they went home,
yeah.
that's where they'd go. And so it's an important part of our industrial history in a lot of ways. And
Right.
it's right now unusable for anything for the rest of time, barring some sort of zoning change.
Okay.
Even if you knocked it down and built a tiny house, you might not be able to meet the parking requirements.
Right.
Right, you couldn't completely knock it down and build something else there.
A parking lot.
Yeah, well, although you still have some issues there because the whole thing is also a basement. So you need to fill that whole basement
right.
up to then put a parking lot over.
Right.
So, do we have, and I guess we don't need to know this right now, but is there an estimate of how many properties we have in Easthampton that are affected by this? Do we know?
No, I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. Jeff might have a better idea, but I would say quite a few, any business that is currently located in neighborhood business
Yeah.
probably does not, like, I'm thinking of, College Highway Variety, for example, or
Yeah.
or
When he was describing it, that's what I had in my head.
yeah, because if you think about it, like you need real parking spaces. In the front of College Highway, you maybe can fit 2.
Yeah.
On the side, you maybe can fit 2.
Mhm.
So, I think a Variety, that probably is just under the threshold that they actually need, right? Probably the same for Old Colony. It's similar, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, just a lot of, the city was built to be walkable, and part of that is that it isn't half parking lots, which is what
Yeah.
I love about it.
Which is fine.
I think it actually makes us a wealthier city, that we actually have
Yeah.
a lot of taxable value per square foot rather than
A lot of
just
parking
a bunch
lots.
of parking lots.
Yeah.
But it does, it's just, and like, I could understand why, if this came up, someone wanted to do something like this, you might get some neighbors saying, well, I don't want a bunch of cars, parking in front of my house, whatever. That's fine. We can have that conversation. But right now, you can't even start that conversation. It's just an instant no.
Right, and that's why I felt, and Councilor Gomez as well, we felt that bringing this forward just gave the city more flexibility as opposed to more rigidity. And
Yeah.
when we're looking at new growth, when we're looking at utilizing the properties that are within the city limits to the maximum extent, flexibility is key.
Mhm.
So that was one of the reasons why I felt like this was something that was worth bringing forward. So
Yeah.
I think it could be beneficial.
Yeah, look, obviously I need to digest it more, but this sounds like a no-brainer. I think also the work of the planning board and the zoning board of appeals speaks for itself. This is something they can easily do.
Right.
It doesn't sound that difficult. So,
No, I believe procedurally wise, we have to send this back to the council and to the planning board.
Right,
So kind of back to ourselves.
yeah.
So would you feel comfortable enough to do that, Brad? To send it so that way we'd start the
Yeah,
clock
yeah,
with the
yeah.
planning board to have the joint public hearing?
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that's an easy move to make.
Because it would still be a lot of time to process and to deliberate, and we'd have the whole planning board public hearing.
Yeah, but where I'm thinking in terms of digesting stuff is to try to think about the ways in which we can do the storytelling that explains why this is problematic and what this solution does.
Mhm.
Because I think anytime you get into zoning ordinances, unless you're somebody that's trained in doing it, most people have no idea what the heck
Right.
is being talked about. So if I can think of a succinct way to say, this is what it can do, here's benefit number 1, here's benefit number 2, whatever, then that's the stuff that I'm thinking about. But
Okay.
of course, yeah, we should
Yeah.
move this along.
So I think that since Tom's setting this one out, well, it'll
Yeah.
have to be us making the motion to bring it back to full council and to the planning board.
Okay. So, I'm just writing this out.
Yep, no problem.
Upstairs, one more floor, in city council chambers.
No, you're fine.
So, move to the full city council and then.
And planning board.
Okay. All right, so, I move, that the proposed amendment be moved to the full city council and the planning board.
I'll second it. All those in favor?
Aye.
Abstentions?
Abstain.
Okay, 1. Okay.
All right.
And I believe that concludes our business. Let's make sure that I know what time our next meeting is. July 18th at 6. Okay. I had my calendar right, so that's good. I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We are adjourned. Okay.
This government meeting is brought to you by Eastworks and our local cable subscribers.